patients. Here at Central Library, State Library Resource Center. Got a little bit of, okay. And today we're going to discuss 6 different crimes that took place in Maryland. And this is part of our Dark Side of Maryland series that we're doing this month. And I'm going to, at the end of the presentation, I'll mention some of the other programs that are going to be coming up. So we chose to highlight crimes that either aren't as high profile as some that you may have heard about over the years, or in one case, one that has direct ties to Maryland that aren't as well known. We do want to say that there is a bit of a content warning here. This is a true crime program, so the themes are definitely adult in nature, and there will be murder and there will be blood, so be forewarned. And we are going to be starting tonight in Colonial, Maryland. So on July 7th, 1657, Henry Gouge's naked body was found floating in a creek in the province of Maryland in the already established St. Mary's County. Gage was a servant to a man named John Dandy, who actually might have done pretty well for himself if he had managed to stay out of trouble. It didn't look good for Dandy. During a previous altercation, Dandy had hit Gouge in the head with an axe, which left a deep gash in his head. And Dandy's wife had had to provide medical care, which included removing pieces of Gouge's skull from the wound. And according to witnesses, not long before Gouge's body was found, he was seen with Dandy, and he was heard crying out while Dandy beat him. So John Dandy was a gunsmith, which was a highly coveted but rare trade in the colonies, and his knowledge and skill most definitely aided him in previous run-ins with the legal system. So by 1641, only a few years after his arrival in the colony, Dandy had already been found guilty of 2 unknown crimes. For one, he was ordered to pay a fine, and for the other, he was actually sentenced to death by Governor Leonard Calvert, but the governor commuted his sentence to 3 years service to the proprietor because of the shortage of gunsmiths. And then about 3 years later, he was again found guilty, this time for the murder of a young indigenous American boy. Dandy was sentenced to death by hanging. However, 2 days after issuing the death warrant, Governor Calvert canceled it. This time, the colonists had petitioned the court because they were concerned about their own well-being in the newly formed colony without a gunsmith. And then that time, he was sentenced to 7 years service, and he was ordered to act as hangman for the colony as punishment. Proceedings stated that he would remain executioner of all corporal corrections according to the writs lawfully directed to him. But due to good behavior, he only served for a little over 3 years. And then in August of 1650, Dandy and his wife, Anne, attacked a man named Thomas Madewell with a hammer, seriously wounding him. Madewell reported the incident to the sheriff, and a warrant was issued to bring the Dandys and Madewell before Governor William Stone. Madewell alleged in his deposition that he believed that if he hadn't escaped, the Dandys would absolutely have murdered him. Governor Stone ordered Dandy to provide 2,000 pounds of tobacco as guarantee that he would appear in court, but by late September, the 2 men had reported that they had settled their differences. However, unfortunately, the following month, Madewell died, possibly as a result of his injuries. And despite English law stipulating that if a person died within a year and a day after being injured, the inflictor of the injuries could be tried for murder, it doesn't seem that any further action was taken against Dandy and his wife. And there was at least one other physical altercation recorded that brought Dandy to court after the Madewell affair. And I've personally read that Dandy was in court either as plaintiff or defendant in lawsuits involving a variety of offenses nearly 100 times. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, Henry Gouge's body was found in 1657. So just a really quick little bit of information about colonial law. The colonies followed early English law until after the American Revolution. And in early English common law, homicide was classified as either felonious or non-felonious. Felonious homicide was comparable to today's murder or manslaughter. And non-felonious homicide was classified as either justifiable or excusable. Justifiable homicide was used to describe the killing of someone committed while in the performance of a legal duty, such as the execution of a death sentence, killings done while trying to arrest an outlaw who was fleeing, or killing to prevent a crime. And then excusable homicide occurred when the killing was done without criminal intent and by accident, misadventure, or self-defense. So the differences between justifiable and excusable homicides were fairly murky, and they often led to inconsistent judicial treatment. And it's also important to point out that the killing of enslaved people, indigenous people, and other marginalized individuals usually fell into one of these last two categories of homicide. I point this out only because this may also have contributed to the reasons why some of Dandy's earlier crimes weren't persecuted as severely. It's also why it's unusual that Dandy finally received serious punishment for the murder of Henry Gouge. I have only seen Gouge described as Dandy's servant. I haven't read anything that would lead me to believe that he was enslaved, or even that he was of African descent. I've read a lot of descriptions of Gouge, and I've only found one that referred to him as being Black, which may actually have been a misinterpretation of the physical description of Gouge's body in the coroner's report. But as we know, of course, enslaved people were treated as property, and unscrupulous enslavers had virtually free reign in their treatment of them, including, unfortunately, murdering them. So Gouge, he could have also been an indentured servant. They most certainly had more rights than those who were enslaved. But although laws existed to protect them from crimes like murder, successful prosecutions of these crimes weren't common either. So maybe it's because of Dandy's previous run-ins with the legal system and his reputation as a litigious hothead that Gouge's murder was taken seriously. As he was merely a young servant, his death would most certainly not have been so remarkable if Dandy's face wasn't so recognizable in court. So because of the reports of witnesses, a month after Gouge's body was found, Dandy was ordered before the provincial court, which at that time was in Calvert County. Testimony statements were taken of 11 people, which included Dandy's wife and Dandy himself. Several witnesses reported in court that although there were no signs of serious injury to Gouge's body when it was found in the creek, when Dandy touched his body while still in the creek, Gouge bled from the nose, mouth, and from his old wounds that he had received as a result of beatings by Dandy. And so in the minds of everyone at this time, this would have proved his guilt. English forensic beliefs aligned more closely with the supernatural, and they believed that if fresh blood appeared on the wounds of a corpse, then that meant that the murderer was present. And actually, his wife had even testified that Dandy had said that he would someday hang for Henry Gouge, though it's not really clear what was meant by that. So after his arrest for Gouge's murder, Dandy escaped to Virginia. And then about a week later, he was found and arrested there and brought back to Maryland. And in an attempt to clear him from further trouble because of his escape, it was claimed in court that he fled thither to put himself into the custody of some in authority there, that there he might have his trial concerning the death of said Gouge in respect the government of this province is not settled. So although this is a bit difficult to understand, he was essentially claiming that he wouldn't receive a fair trial in Maryland. And as you might imagine, Dandy's claims didn't sit well with Maryland's courts, although they did order an examination of Gouge's body at Dandy's request. So the court ordered that the body be exhumed by Mr. James Veitch, who was the sheriff of St. Mary's County at the time, and examined by Veitch, as many neighbors as could be rounded up, and 2 doctors. They were then to remove Gouge's head and bring it into the court. And interestingly, in the book Outlines of the History of Medicine and the Medical Profession, which was written by physician and medical historian Johann Hermann Baas and published in 1889, the author says that the earliest autopsy and verdict of coroner's jury that he had found during his research was actually for Henry Gouge. So essentially what this means is that this makeshift coroner's jury, which was made up of a county sheriff, a couple of medical professionals, and a whole slew of neighbors, is the first reported team that the author could find to conduct an autopsy for legal reasons in the United States. Baas didn't find any other reports of autopsies in the colonies until after 1650, and coroners weren't even appointed for Maryland counties until 1666. So this time, Dandy was again found guilty, and he was sentenced to hang the following Saturday. And this time they wasted no time, and he was promptly hung. And according to Emily Emerson Lance, who was an early contributor to the Baltimore Sun, Dandy was hung on Brooms Island, which is in the southern part of Calvert County. It's said to be the first place in Maryland to put capital punishment into effect. But why the rush to hang Dandy this time, right? Was it the damning evidence, the bleeding wounds, the comments he made to his wife and his fleeing the province? Or maybe they didn't want a chance that his sentence would be commuted like it had been previously. Maybe they were just tired of Dandy's bad attitude. Or maybe, as Rick Cottam from WYPR's Your Maryland said in his episode called The Murderous Career of John Dandy, it was because the colony had acquired a second gunsmith. Yeah.
Okay, this is going to be really bloody, so if you're at all squeamish, you might want to plug your ears and close your eyes. On April 14th, 1939, in East Baltimore, 8-year-old Nick Krebner was playing with his sister in the street, as city kids like to do. They were playing ball. Nick's ball rolled down the sewer, and he lifted the manhole cover and crawled down into the manhole to retrieve his ball. He found his ball, but also found a human hand wrapped in a newspaper. He came out of the sewer and ran to report this to the owner of a corner store, who promptly called the police. The police arrived at the corner of Lombard and Wolf Streets and descended into the sewer. They came up with the hand and also with part of a leg, also wrapped in newspaper. Thus began a massive search of the East Baltimore sewer system, including a police boat stationed in the place where the sewer system expelled its contents into the Baltimore harbor, on the lookout for neatly wrapped paper packages containing body parts. Boys in the neighborhood made it their business to search the sewer system as well. Some were climbing into the sewers, and others fishing in open manholes with poles. Ultimately, the police, Department of Sanitation workers, and neighborhood children found female body parts and articles of women's clothing in 8 locations in East Baltimore. 6 of these locations were in a 7 or 8 block area between Fayette and Lombard and South Durham and Chester Streets that ironically half overlapped the Butcher's Hill neighborhood. So the police had a job to do. They had to map the area where the parts were found to determine where the murder likely occurred. They had to investigate missing persons reports, and they had to piece the parts together to determine whose body they belonged to. But determining identity would be difficult because they still didn't have the head. The story was covered extensively in the newspapers. The News Post, the yellow Hearst paper that thrived on murder and mayhem, featured lurid photographs and huge double-decker headlines for weeks about the case. The more sedate Sun paper covered the case too, though in a less sensational manner. The News Post initially quoted experts who said that anybody could have carved up the body in that manner, but changed their tune a couple of days later, quoting experts who thought that it had to have been the work of a doctor or a medical student or even a taxidermist. The missing persons reports included Minerva W. Beach, a missing Johns Hopkins nursing school student, Emma Hirschberger of South Register Street in East Baltimore, not far from where most of the parts had been recovered, and a woman named Esther Boblitz, who had been reported missing from her home in Parkton, Maryland, after having had an argument with her father. All of these women and others, one by one, saw their names in the paper and reported in that they were alive and well. There was some thought that this murderer, who by now the papers were referring to as the torso murderer, might be the same as a serial killer in Cleveland, also known as the torso murderer. The Cleveland killer had similarly carved up his 13 victims and scattered their parts widely. The police mapped the location of the recovered body parts, and the News Post did too. Here is the News Post map. As you can see, by April 17th, most of the parts that had been found so far were found in a 6 or 7 block area. The only clues found beyond this area were 2 pairs of women's shoes found on Linwood Avenue between Preston and Biddle, and 2 body parts, a dress and a knife blade, on a trash heap behind City Hospital. It's interesting that they would be able to connect stray pairs of shoes to the murder. I guess in those days it was rather uncommon to come across shoes lying around outdoors, but these days, in my experience, they're all over the place. So I don't know, that may say something about societal breakdown. I don't know what it says exactly, but in any case, the interesting thing about the shoes was that the leather lifts on one pair had an unusual pattern of nails, and 5 nails instead of the usual 3 or 4. So the police carried the shoes around to local cobblers, searching for one who used this technique in hopes they might be able to identify the victim. Meanwhile, they were looking closely at a missing person report that had been filed on August 15th by a resident at 110 South Durham Street, a block from the area where most of the body parts had up to that point been recovered. A worker at Bethlehem Steel named Aurelio Marco Tarquinio, who went by Marco, had reported on Saturday, April 15th, that his housekeeper, Evelyn Rice, had gone missing. Detectives carried the recovered clothing items up and down Durham Street, asking if anyone could identify who they belonged to. 12-year-old Rita Nazialik, who lived across the street from 110 Durham Street, knew who the blue polka-dotted house dress the police had found belonged to. It belonged to Evelyn Rice, Marco's 31-year-old housekeeper. A News Post fashion columnist had predicted, based on 2 pairs of recovered pajamas, that the victim was a woman of taste. Quote, "That pitiful little handful of clothes at detective headquarters shows that she loved brightness and smartness and a little flair of drama in her daily life." And sure enough, Evelyn Rice, who you see there, had been a beauty queen in her younger years, winning the Fort Valley, Georgia Peach Festival beauty contest in 1924 at age 16. The News Post called her the toast of the Georgia peach industry. It drew a comparison between Evelyn and other queens throughout history who had been beheaded. Evelyn, whose maiden name was New, married a businessman named W. Brooks Rice soon after her triumph at the Peach Festival, and they had 2 sons. The 2 divorced in 1937, citing incompatibility, and then Evelyn remarried a soldier named Robert Finney. But that marriage, too, was not a happy one. She left him behind in Florida and hitchhiked to Baltimore. She found work in Baltimore as part of a mind-reading magic act and as a barmaid at a bar on South Broadway Street in Fells Point, owned by Tarquinio. Marco's tavern went under a year or so later, and Evelyn, who by now was romantically involved with Marco, became his housekeeper. While Marco himself fell back on his other job as a tong runner in the pipe mill at Bethlehem Steel. The police detained Tarquinio, but he insisted that he knew nothing about Evelyn's whereabouts. That is, until the day after Marco's arrest, when detectives carried into the interrogation room Evelyn's head. Where had they found it? While neighbors peered in from nearby windows, the police dug up Marco's prized rose garden in the tiny backyard of his row house. 2 feet under the soil in a corner of the yard, one of the diggers hit some blocks of concrete and pieces of stone and soil that seemed as though it had been recently or freshly turned. The police sergeant lifted one of the stones, and there, behold, was a human backbone, then a pink nightgown, then a thigh, and then, oh my God, a human head. And you can see this is from the News Post, and we've colorized the blue polka dot dress. And here's a News Post photograph, which is actually in our collection, of the police detectives carrying the head and other parts out of the house on 110 South Durham Street in a metal tub. The police brought the tub of evidence to the Eastern Police Station and confronted Tarquinio with it. After first denying that he had anything to do with it, the disturbing sight of Evelyn's head freaked Marco out enough that 10 minutes later he confessed. He never thought he would see it again. In fact, on the Saturday after the crime, Marco had joined a group of neighbors who were discussing the morning's headlines about the body parts being found all over their neighborhood. And Marco was visibly nervous, and he said that they would never find the head. Well, the neighbors reported the strange behavior to the police, which was another bit of evidence that helped them focus in on Tarquinio. This is the backyard as it currently looks in Google Maps, and I've sort of touched it up using the filter, the night vision goggles filter to make it look creepier. But Marco Tarquinio confessed to dissecting Evelyn's body in his cellar and disposing of the pieces over a 2-day period. The police found bloodstains all over the concrete floor of his cellar, a bloodstained mop, and bloodstained trousers soaking in the utility tub. When you think about it, a small East Baltimore row house is not the ideal place to commit a murder if you intend to get away with it. What does one do with the body? Cutting it into pieces and disposing of each piece separately was the way that Tarquinio approached it. Row house neighbors are close-knit. Row house neighborhoods are close-knit. Suspicious behavior is noticed. Neighbors had noticed a loud quarrel between Marco and Evelyn on Friday evening, April 14th, and that Marco seemed to be doing something in his basement later that same night, all night, that involved running a lot of water. And they also noticed that he was digging all day in his yard on April 15th. One neighbor had seen him leave the house with a package. The neighbor who saw Marco with the package was on her way to donate blood at the hospital. She called out playfully to Marco, "Hey, Marco, got any blood?" She testified that he looked stricken. Tarquinio was charged by a grand jury with causing death by cutting and stabbing Evelyn Rice with a butcher knife. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but later changed to a general not guilty plea, claiming that the presentation of Evelyn's head had caused him to confess under duress. But the evidence against Marco was overwhelming. When he reported Evelyn missing to the police, Marco told Sergeant Carl Walter that she had probably gone off with Baltimore Blackie. Then he said, if she doesn't quit going around with Blackie, I'm going to kill her and Blackie both. Baltimore Blackie was identified as George Geisendorfer, an acquaintance of Marco's whom Evelyn had met when she hitchhiked to Baltimore. Geisendorfer and several others testified about the threats that they had witnessed the jealous Tarquinio making against Evelyn on several occasions. These threats included fixing her, chopping off her head, and cutting her up into pieces. The medical examiner testified that the cause of death was fracture of the skull caused by a sharp instrument. There was a stab wound that penetrated to the brain, and another horizontal wound on the right front of the head, also caused by a sharp instrument. Either could have been the fatal blow. The medical examiner went on to say that neither would have caused immediate death. At that point, state's attorney William H. Maynard asked, what effect would dissection have on a living human being? Judge Edwin Dickerson interjected before the medical examiner could respond. We can draw our own conclusions. Tarquinio's attorney argued that Evelyn, wielding a knife, fell down the steps as she struggled with Marco. She died when her head hit the edge of a step on the opposite set of stairs leading out of the cellar into the yard. Tarquinio panicked, retrieved the knife, and worked to conceal the body through dismemberment. Even so, Tarquinio was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Maryland pen. He was released after 15 years for good behavior at age 60. Okay.
So we're going to move now to Baltimore City's University of Maryland Medical School. And I'm sure you've all heard of the school and its history of excellence and innovation. But I don't know if you know that it is the 5th oldest medical school in the United States, or that it was the first public medical school in the United States. It opened in 1807 as the College of Medicine of Maryland. And 2 of its founders, John Beal Davidge and Nathaniel Potter, arrived as part of a wave of educated professionals to the city following the American Revolution. Its contributions to the field of medicine are too many to name, but a few notable areas of innovation include that it was the first medical school to institute a residency training program. Its preeminent physicians and faculty discovered the Q fever vaccine, the first human retrovirus, as well as the link between HIV and AIDS, found cures for typhus and typhoid fever, have won numerous awards, including Nobel Prizes, and can claim former directors of the CDC and more than one Surgeon General as alumni. It's hosted researchers who have made great strides in the fields of cancer research, organ transplant research, cardiovascular research, neuroscience, and virology. It housed the first shock trauma center in the US, which was founded by one of the university's professors. And its campus also includes Davidge Hall, which at over 200 years old survives as the oldest existing anatomical theater, as well as the oldest building in the Western Hemisphere continuously used for medical education. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. It's located in downtown Baltimore on Lombard Street. And it was, of course, named after its founder, John Beal Davidge. And as you can see, from the photograph, and when you've seen it, it features grand architecture. Its design attribution has been debated, and some of the period's most well-known architects' names have been attached to it. Names like Robert Carey Long Sr., Benjamin Henry Latrobe, Thomas Jefferson, and Maximilian Godfrey. But debates and architecture aside, for the purposes of this program, I'll say that Davidge Hall also boasts a history more fascinating and controversial than you might think. So first, I want to talk a little bit about John Beale Davidge and the world of medicine during his time. So though Davidge was a Maryland native, he had trained at the world-renowned medical school at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, Scotland. And prior to Davidge Hall's construction, Davidge taught lectures on anatomy, physiology, and surgery in a small anatomical theater that he had built himself. Unfortunately, he had his opponents who disagreed with his use of cadavers in his teaching, and mobs began forming outside of his classes, which is what prompted the building of this new hall. And angry mobs and dissenters had become so common that when Davidge Hall was built in 1812, the design included secret stairwells and passageways for professors and students to escape through if a mob formed. And you can see one of these stairwells leading to a passageway here in the photo on the top right. But these secret passageways likely also had another use. Fresh bodies that had been stolen from recently dug graves could be covertly brought into the building using these passageways. So the University of Maryland Medical School joined schools in Europe when it became the first medical school in the US to make human dissection by medical students compulsory. Corpses for medical study were not as easy to come by prior to the end of the 19th century, and all sorts of unscrupulous methods were employed to acquire them. Grave robbing became common. The first reported case dates all the way back to 1319 in Italy, but it continued for centuries after that. And there were many reasons that grave robbing became necessary. There was a reduction in executions starting in the 17th and 18th centuries, and executed criminals had been the traditional source of cadavers. There was also a proliferation of medical schools and anatomical study. Poor refrigeration methods meant that fresh bodies didn't stay fresh for long, of course, and punishment for grave robbing was minimal. The convicted were given a fine or imprisoned for a short period. It was a bit of an open secret because the practice was condoned by many medical practitioners and institutions who believed it was a necessary evil. They believed that the benefits of studying cadavers offset the horror of stealing bodies. And so people developed creative solutions to the problem. Relatives of the deceased would guard the graves all night, and devices were invented, such as iron coffins, grave alarms, cemetery guns, and coffin torpedoes, and the iron bar structure that you see on the bottom left here that was built around a coffin and known as a mort safe. And people did sometimes run into trouble while attempting to rob graves. Here are a couple of newspaper articles detailing the killings of grave robbers caught in the act. In the one on the top left, a woman's grieving widow set up camp in the cemetery and shot a grave robber who was trying to steal her body. And in the other one on the bottom, a robber was killed by one of these grave alarm torpedoes while attempting a heist. So, as corpses became more difficult to come by, those looking for them to sell to medical schools became more innovative, as well as more diabolical. If you can't find a dead body to sell readily, what's the next step, right? Create your own, of course. And in probably the most famous case, a pair of criminals in Edinburgh, Scotland, William Burke and William Hare, began killing lodgers in Hare's lodging house. Because those killed were generally poor, older, physically or mentally ill, or addicts, and weren't regularly checking in with friends or family. And because the two had devised a unique method for killing that left the bodies relatively unmarked, they were able to get away with killing at least 16 people to sell to the local anatomy school before being caught and tried for their crimes. Hare confessed to all the crimes, turned against Burke, and in court claimed that Burke was the one who committed all of the murders. After the trial, Burke was found guilty and hung, and Hare got off. And as a result of the case, which was reported around the world, a new term was coined, burking, which refers to a specific method of killing which leaves no marks so that it looks like the victim died of natural causes and won't raise suspicion when sold for medical use. But over time, the term has been used more generally to refer to the act of killing in order to sell the body for dissection. And this brings us to the University of Maryland Medical School and the only known burking case in the United States. I'm going to tell you about something the school probably prefers not to be known for. So in 1886, a janitor at the University of Maryland named Anderson Perry claimed that he had agreed to purchase a body from a stranger for $15 for the University of Maryland to use. He said that after he received the body, he noticed marks on it, suggesting that the person hadn't died of natural causes, and he reported this to the doctor on site. When the doctor examined the body, he found the head had been crushed and there were puncture wounds in the left breast, and so he reported it to the police. Although the coroner concluded that the marks had occurred post-mortem, the police were still suspicious. They began checking missing persons reports, which led them to learn about a missing woman, named Emily Brown. She'd been missing from Pig Alley, which was located between Paca and Utah streets. And 11-year-old Sarah Bloxam was brought in to identify the body. She told police the body was Miss Emily Brown. And Sarah was the daughter of Mary Bloxam, who Emily Brown had been paying $2.50 a week to live with. The 11-year-old Sarah was also reportedly the last to see Miss Brown alive. And Emily Brown had had a difficult life. Let me see if I can get back to this. I'm able to get it. She had lived in Easton, Maryland, and had been a dressmaker until she became addicted to morphine and alcohol. She moved to Baltimore about 15 years prior to her murder, and not much is known about that time period before this event happened, but it's said that she had been begging on the streets for at least 2 years. And some weeks she only got 50 cents. And Mary Bloxam claimed that she often would drink all of that money immediately. So Mary Bloxam had approached her and told her that she either needed to pay up or she was going to have to leave for good. So when the police spoke to janitor Anderson Perry, they found his story suspicious. Let me see if I can get this. I'm having a little trouble with the slides here. Okay. Let me see. What is happening with notes? Yeah, I can't get, thank you. Can't get, there we go. Thank you. Okay, thanks. When the police spoke to the janitor Anderson Perry, they found his story suspicious. And when they arrested him, he implicated 2 other men, John Thomas Ross and Albert Hawkins. Ross was Mary Bloxam's son from her first marriage, and she was set to marry Anderson Perry the following week. So she was detained as a witness as well. When he spoke to the police, Ross confessed to the murder. He said that Perry had suggested he kill Emily Brown and sell the body to the university to make some money. He said he brought Albert Hawkins in to stand watch. Ross struck her head with a brick, crushing her skull, and then he claimed that Hawkins stabbed her to be sure that she was dead. News of the case traveled all over the country. Albert Hawkins was eventually found guilty for his part in the crime and given a lengthy sentence. He died in prison of natural causes not long after his incarceration. John Thomas Ross was found guilty and hung. And Perry was found not guilty despite his reported role as the mastermind. His lawyers tried to show that he wasn't capable of planning a murder by painting him as incapacitated both physically and mentally, stating, quote, "Long ago he suffered an attack of paralysis with which he is affected yet. He's known to those who come into contact with him as an exceptionally stupid man." Although there had been a state anatomy law passed before the murder, it wasn't effective in regulating how cadavers were acquired. And following the crime and the trial, in 1888, anatomical professors signed a petition to modify the act, claiming that shortages in bodies meant that they had to rely on body snatching. This led to a bill provided for the use of unclaimed bodies for dissection. And in 1890, a state anatomical board was formed, partly because of the Emily Brown case and partly because of the professor's petition. And as for the man who got away with the crime, Anderson Perry, not long after the trial, he died unexpectedly of natural causes. And in an ironic twist, his body was given to the university for student use in dissections.
Okay, here we have, excuse me, my voice is a little funky because I'm getting over a cold, but here we have a story involving lesbians as the victims of a bizarre criminal scheme to break up their home and separate them from their money. The case was covered in papers across the country. Have you ever noticed that mansion on the northeast corner of St. Paul and 39th Streets in Guilford? At one time, the house belonged to the Lynch family. That's the Lynch of the brokerage firm Merrill Lynch. Merrill's Baltimore-born partner, Edmund C. Lynch, died in 1938 while on business in London and left part of his fortune to his tennis-playing sister, Frances, back in his hometown. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Frances was living, as described by the Sun, with her, quote, longtime secretary and companion, Mabel Murray, whom she supported. The outbreak of war in Europe played an unfortunate role in this story as it resulted in the stranding in the US of a young 24-year-old British tennis star named Valerie Scott, who had arrived in 1939 with the British Whiteman Cup tennis team. Frances Lynch most generously offered her home, the one in Guilford. She also had a home in the Green Spring Valley and another one, as we shall see, in Miami Beach. So she offered her Guilford home to the stranded Scott. The two took advantage of this arrangement to enter various local doubles matches, which, despite Frances's middle age, they won. Meanwhile, Scott also joined several singles competitions. At an invitation tournament at the Baltimore Country Club, Scott lost only to the top American women's tennis star, Alice Marble. That wasn't the only time she'd played marble that year. At the 1940 National Singles Championship in New York, Scott also lost to Marble, but she gave her a good game. According to the Associated Press, quote, the English Miss kept dropping the ball just over the net, and Miss Marble had to come racing in from her favored baseline position time and again to haul the match out. Scott was an excellent player. She had also won the Junior Wimbledon tournament in 1935. Here she wins the women's singles competition of the 16th annual Arizona Open tennis tournament. As time went on, Scott began to feel ill and not herself, and decided that the thing to do was to take a rest cure in California. Those days, people were always taking rest cures. Ever the generous women's tennis patron, Lynch gave Scott the use of her car and advanced her spending money. But in California, Scott apparently came under malevolent influence. She befriended a woman named Margaret Schuyler Sternberg, who introduced her to another woman who was both a seeress and a psychiatrist. According to the Sun, Scott was an astrology buff, so seeresses would have been right up her alley. The three, Scott, Sternberg, and the seeress, became fast friends. I believe that an LA area psychic named Lorena Rule was the seeress. I've not been able to establish her acquaintance with Valerie Scott or Miss Sternberg, but there are so many details that point to her being the one. By the way, in the newspaper, she's just referred to as the seeress. So, but there are a lot of details that point to Lorena Rule. She was well known locally, had a column in the San Fernando Valley Times, spoke a lot to women's clubs, and collaborated with the police on solving local crimes. She saw herself as having special crime-solving powers. Moreover, her father was an old-time cowboy named William Thomas Rule, who for a time lived in Texas and worked rounding up cattle rustlers. He was still alive, an old man, and living in the LA area at the time of Valerie Scott's stay in LA. And as we shall see, an elderly former Texas Ranger plays a part in this episode. The seeress apparently was seeing money. She convinced Scott that she could double her money by investing in an oil well with a certain promoter. But the problem was that Scott didn't have any money. So she wrote to the generous and oh so innocent Frances Lynch back in Baltimore, who sent her $10,000. The oil promoter subsequently ended up in an Oklahoma jail, and needless to say, the $10,000 did not double, but rather evaporated into nothing. But the seer's seeing did not end there. She also saw that Frances Lynch's longtime companion and secretary in Baltimore, Mabel Murray, whom Scott had described to the seer, was holding Lynch prisoner in her own home, and that it was up to Scott to save Lynch from the nefarious Murray. The three, Scott, Sternberg, and the seeress, plus a private detective recommended by the seeress, crowded into Scott's borrowed car and headed back toward Baltimore to save Frances Lynch. Apparently, Frances didn't at all feel that she needed saving. It is unclear whether he did this on his own initiative or in collaboration with Scott, but the private detective with the perfect name Jack Lamar attempted to blackmail Lynch by accusing her of over-medicating Scott with illegal narcotics back when Scott was an ill house guest on St. Paul Street a few months back. At this point, Frances Lynch was wising up. She and Murray, stunned and distraught, fled Baltimore for their Miami home. Not to be deterred, the four, Scott, Sternberg, the seeress, and Lamar, followed in pursuit. But in Miami, 3 of the 4 disappeared, leaving Valerie Scott begging to be admitted to Lynch's home, but being refused. Scott was eventually picked up on vagrancy charges and given temporary shelter in the Dade County Jail. In a plot twist, Sternberg, Scott's California buddy, returned to Miami, this time accompanied by a figure right out of the Old West. The 81-year-old described himself as a former Texas Ranger who had killed 54 men in his younger years. He had a trunk full of guns. At this point, Lynch reached out and offered to pay Scott's way back to England. Scott, still in jail on the vagrancy charges, refused. She should have accepted. On January 22nd, more charges, as well as the former charges of vagrancy, were brought against Scott and now Sternberg by the Dade County solicitor. They were accused of conspiring to blackmail Lynch and into firing Murray and hiring Scott instead as her secretary. They were also charged with falsely accusing Mabel Murray of a crime. Scott claimed that she was innocent, knew nothing about the blackmail, and that she was played by the seer in her scheme to separate Lynch from her money. At this point, they were released on $500 bail each. Now get ready for another major plot twist. A few months later, on May 19th, Frances Lynch died in a Miami hospital of a brain hemorrhage at age 51. She had been ill since April 26, when she'd suffered a first hemorrhage while on a fishing trip. In my mind, this is a little suspicious, but there's nothing in the papers to indicate that there was foul play. Mabel inherited almost everything. On July 16th, charges against Scott and Sternberg were dropped because the Dade County solicitor felt there was inadequate evidence without the testimony of the prime witness. Scott stuck around in the US. In 1951, she founded a tennis club in Milwaukee and worked as a tennis pro there until 1981, when she retired. She was given a Distinguished Service Award by the US Professional Tennis Association, and so ended the unusual career of a player who gave new meaning to the phrase tennis racket. Margaret Schuyler Sternberg had a volume of poetry found after her death, published posthumously by Ex Libris Press. According to the publisher, Sternberg, quote, was an independent spirit, an artist, a musician, and a poet. And the poems, quote, reveal a lifelong struggle for justice and goodness. Okay, back to the St. Paul Street house. And here's the tennis, what remains of the tennis court in the backyard. It's, as you can see, covered with a lot of vegetation. The pole you see in the upper left is what's left of the net. Okay. All right, I'm going to continue on with one more crime, and then Caprice will finish up. This is a well-known historical event, but what is less well remembered is that so many of the related incidents occurred in Baltimore and other parts of Maryland. It might be thought of as a Washington thing, but it was also very much a Maryland thing. In fact, one could construct a Hiss Chambers walking tour of Baltimore, ending with a drive over to a certain infamous pumpkin patch near Westminster. Has anybody heard of this before? Anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay. I'll give a brief overview of the case and then cover the local details. Alger Hiss was a handsome, Harvard-educated lawyer whose career trajectory pointed steeply upward. He clerked for Supreme Court justices and worked for prominent law firms before taking various positions in the New Deal bureaucracy, working first for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, then the Senate's Nye Committee, the DOJ, and finally the State Department. He was with Roosevelt in Yalta and was the Secretary General of the United Nations Organizing Committee in San Francisco. From there, he was appointed director of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was a golden boy. One day in the summer of 1948, a rumpled, overweight Whittaker Chambers, who was then a senior editor for Time magazine and a contrite former communist, sat before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He told the assembled Congress members and staff that he had known Hiss in the mid-1930s in a communist cell made up of federal employees who shared the goal of rising to positions of power in the US government. In fact, he and his family had been rather close to Hiss and his family, so he said. Hiss demanded an opportunity to refute Chambers. He was given a slot to appear before the committee a couple of days later. Under oath, he claimed with seeming indignation not to know Chambers by the assumed name of Carl, as Chambers had previously testified, and not even to recognize Chambers from a photo. He was adamant that he had never been a communist. Unlike other witnesses before the committee, he appeared voluntarily and he didn't take the fifth, as most of the other witnesses did. He initially made a good impression on the committee and the press. In a subsequent hearing on August 25th, one of the first House committee hearings ever to be televised, Hiss was telegenic. Chambers definitely wasn't. It seemed like Hiss had won the day. However, one congressperson remained unconvinced, a new rep from California named Richard Nixon. To make a long story short, it eventually came out that Hiss did know Chambers, although he claimed to know him under another name, George Crossley, only as a hard-up acquaintance whom he had helped out in various ways. Hiss sued Chambers for libel in September 1948 in U.S. District Court in Baltimore. But during the process of discovery in that trial, Chambers made the more serious charge that Hiss had actually passed government documents to him that he had then turned over to Soviet operatives. After Chambers provided evidence to back that up, Hiss was charged with perjury as the statute of limitations on espionage had run out. After 2 trials, he was found guilty and spent a few years in the federal pen in Lewisburg, PA. The case was big, maybe as gripping as the O.J. Simpson trial later in the century. There's a great book by Susan Jacoby that looks at the case in its cultural context, Alger Hiss and the Battle for History. I'd recommend it. It's on the table back there if you want to check it out. There were a lot of books written on this case, but that one is sort of more recent and it's kind of interesting. I found it very interesting in putting the case in more of a cultural context. The case was covered extensively in the press, and there was hardly a person who didn't have an opinion on it. Hiss had a great many defenders. The case seemed to put the integrity of the New Deal in question at a time when there was beginning to be a backlash to the New Deal. One's political views were immediately evident depending on what your perception of Hiss's guilt or innocence was. Instead of going into all the details and arguing for guilt or innocence, I will point out the Maryland connections. Okay, first, Alger Hiss was born in Baltimore into a middle-class family living on Linden Street in Bolton Hill, in this house from, in this photo from our collection. The house no longer exists. It was torn down when an apartment tower went in there. Hiss, and you can see this is from a Bromley Atlas in our collection. You can see where the house was. Hiss's father committed suicide when Alger was a young child, and Hiss was raised by his mother and sister, who also tragically committed suicide in a life that has been characterized as shabby gentility. Hiss went to City College for high school and then Johns Hopkins for college, where he excelled. Here's his senior yearbook picture in 1926 from our collection. I'm going to read part of the text. Many are the discussions we have had with Alger, many and various. The topics ranged from Soviets to styles, from liberty to liquor, from Guelphs to Goodnow. And like Socrates, we admit our ignorance in the face of his irresistible logic and rhetoric. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa. There he is at the top middle. Here he's shown as the leading man in the Hopkins production of His Majesty Bunker Bean. You can see him smooching with his leading lady on the right page there in the middle. After Hopkins, Hiss went on to Harvard Law. Whittaker Chambers and his wife had at least 5 addresses in Baltimore in the mid to late 30s when the espionage was occurring and just after. This is 903 St. Paul Street, where they lived in 1934. This is 1617 Utah Place. They lived in apartment C. This is in Bolton Hill, and they lived there in 1936. Hiss would visit Chambers and his wife there after seeing his mother, who at the time still lived in Bolton Hill. This is 3310 Auchentrolley Terrace, where Chambers lived in 1937, across the street from the Rawlings Conservatory. These are city directories. You can, they're from our collection. You can see that Chambers lived under many aliases. He lived under Lloyd Cantwell at the Utah Place apartment, At Auchentrolley Terrace, he lived under his father's name, J. Chambers. This is 2124 Mount Royal Terrace, where Chambers lived in 1938, and the left side of this duplex. This is the house in Reservoir Hill, where Chambers described having a spiritual experience that cemented his break from communism. Chambers took the Penn Line to Washington, where he allegedly would pick up the documents from Hiss, who allegedly pilfered or borrowed them from the State Department, and then he would take them back to Baltimore on the Penn Line to have them photographed. First, Chambers photographed the documents himself in a photographic lab he set up in the Baltimore apartment of party members William and Anna Spiegel. And you can see they lived at 112 East Madison, and they had a business at the same address. Later, he turned the documents over to photographer Felix A. Inslerman, who lived and worked at 2113 Callow Avenue in Reservoir Hill for photographing. Later that night or the next morning, Chambers would return them to Hiss via the Penn Line. This photo from our collection is from 1937, and it shows what the Penn Station would have looked like around the time that Chambers was ferrying the documents back and forth between Washington and Baltimore. In the first month after Chambers broke with the communist underground, he hid out with his family in Pikesville in rooms in a house that he described as oriented toward Old Court Road, but set back from the street. Because the address was never divulged, I don't have a pic of it. Then, after hiding out in Pikesville for several months, Chambers bought a house in the 2600 block of St. Paul Street. He was only there for a year. Soon after, the family moved to a farm just north of Westminster at the corner of Bachman Mills Road and Sawmill Road that Chambers had recently purchased, where they lived a quiet life for about a decade until the House Un-American Activities Committee hearing in 1948. This is the Carroll County phone directory from our collection. The initials presumably stand for J. David Whitaker Chambers. At some point, he began to refer to himself as David. He had so many different names. This is the farm. The house on the left is not the house Chambers lived in. It burnt down in a fire, but it was rebuilt on the same footprint. I think his son may live there now. The barn is original from the time period that Chambers lived there. During the libel trial's discovery process, Hiss's lawyer, prominent Baltimore attorney William L. Marbury, several times challenged Chambers to produce evidence of his association with Hiss. Well, it turns out Chambers had squirreled away some documents, both paper and microfilm. In a dramatic flourish, Chambers led investigators to a hollowed out pumpkin in a volunteer pumpkin patch on his farm. From the pumpkin, he removed microfilm. Of course, it couldn't have been the same pumpkin where he put it, 10 years ago, but he sort of had a flair for the dramatic. So he claimed to have retained it as evidence around the time that he was beginning to have misgivings about communism. During the Reagan administration, some conservatives were successful in an effort to get the Chambers Westminster farm designated as a historical landmark, despite the lack of historical integrity of the site. For example, there was no longer a pumpkin patch. In fact, a Salon article claims that the area where the pumpkin patch is partially paved over now. I think what you see outside the barn there, it's a a parking lot, a little parking lot. That's where I parked when I went to take the photos. So that would have been where the pumpkin patch had been. Okay, I think the Mount Royal Terrace house is a much better site for a plaque. After all, Chambers' spiritual experience, which occurred there, was the decisive moment in his break from communism and an important episode in the history of the conservative movement. And whether we agree with it or not, that movement has been an important feature of American life and politics for the last 50 years or so. One thing that needs to be remembered is that at the time of Hiss's alleged involvement with Chambers, the Soviet Union seemed, though in retrospect, not always reliably, to be the only power taking a hard line against the rise of Nazism in Europe. Many young idealistic Americans sympathized with that. The later Nazi-Soviet pact came as a shock to those who were formerly sympathetic to the Soviets. In fact, it was 2 days after that pact was signed that Chambers first confessed his communist activities to the government in the person of Assistant Secretary of State Adolf Berle. However, it seems that that information was shelved for 10 years or so, and not really brought out until that House committee hearing in 1948. It's not known how the Soviet-Nazi pact affected Hiss, since he continued throughout his whole life to claim innocence and to never have had any, and claim to never have had any allegiance to the Soviets.
Okay. So now I'm going to tell you our final story, perhaps the most despicable of all of today's criminals. So in the spring of 1976, William Bradley Bishop told his secretary that he was feeling like he might be coming down with the flu and that he needed to go home. What he actually did was drive to the bank to withdraw $400. He then went to Sears at Montgomery Mall in Montgomery County to buy a gas can and a sledgehammer, followed by a hardware store to pick up a...
Attention. The library will be closing in 15 minutes. The library will be closing
Just in time.
15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so followed by the hardware store to pick up a pitchfork and a shovel. It seemed that Bishop had a plan. So William Bradley Bishop was intelligent and highly educated. He got his bachelor's from Yale and later earned 2 master's degrees. He'd grown up the all-American boy. He played football in high school, joined the military, and eventually married his high school sweetheart, Annette, a popular high school cheerleader. He also spoke 5 languages fluently, and while in the military began working in counterintelligence. Once he was out of the military, Bishop started working for the U.S. State Department in Foreign Service, and while working in Foreign Service, he was stationed in various countries from Italy to Botswana. His military training, his ability to speak many languages, and his keen intelligence suited the line of work. And in 1974, he was assigned a posting in Washington, D.C. at the State Department headquarters. He, his wife Annette, his 3 sons now, aged 14, 10, and 5, and his mother Lobelia moved to a house in the D.C. suburbs in Bethesda, Maryland. And though the family seemed like an enviable upper middle class family with 3 kids, a dog, 2 cars and a motorcycle, as well as regular tennis playing outings, swimming at the local community club, and skiing, it seems things at home weren't what they appeared in public. Friends and family claimed Bishop and Annette seemed close, but their relationship also was not likely what it seemed. On March 8th, 1976, a neighbor reported not seeing the Bishop family for a while. So police reported to the Bishop home for a wellness check and immediately knew something was wrong when they spotted blood leading from the front door to the driveway. Inside the house, police found blood everywhere. There was blood and other evidence of foul play in each of the house's 4 bedrooms and the upstairs bathroom. They found blood-soaked sheets, mattresses, and pillowcases, but all 6 of the family members, Bishop, his wife, their 3 sons, and Bishop's mother, were missing, along with the family dog, Leo. A few days before that, a forest ranger in North Carolina had seen smoke in a remote area. When he investigated the fire, he found 5 charred bodies. They'd been bludgeoned before being set aflame, and they turned out to be Bishop's wife, his 3 sons, and his mother. But where was Bishop? News of the murders sent the suburban community where the Bishops lived into shock. The Washington Post headline the day after police found blood in the Bishop home and learned that the bodies in North Carolina were Bishop's family only reported that the family had been slain and the father was missing. Surely William Bradley Bishop, happy and content with his marriage and family, wasn't involved in these murders. But investigators later pieced together evidence that told a different story. The day that the murders most likely took place, Bishop had discovered that a coworker had received a promotion that he felt should have gone to him. He then complained of feeling ill and left work. And this is when he withdrew the money from the bank, bought the tools he'd need to commit the murders, and returned home. After murdering his family, he loaded their bodies into the family station wagon, along with their, luckily, very much alive golden retriever, Leo, and drove almost 300 miles from their home just outside of DC to North Carolina, where he put their bodies in the shallow grave and set the graves on fire. Weeks later, Bishop's police station was found abandoned in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. In it were snack wrappers, dog treat wrappers, and credit card receipts for a sporting goods shop and a convenience store. Eyewitnesses at the store said that he wasn't alone, but that he was seen with a woman and a dog, most likely our friend Leo. And after that, although investigators have never given up the search, there have been no verifiable sightings of Bishop. He appears to have vanished off the face of the earth, and his whereabouts and fate remain a mystery to this day. So why would a man like Bishop, seemingly normal and well-adjusted to friends and family, crack like he did? No one knows for sure, but there are theories. Bishop's work for the U.S. State Department was a little vague to those who knew him. There have been some who have thought that he may have been working as a spy and that someone was exacting revenge on him. Though given the evidence, signs definitely point to Bishop as the murderer. And JP, can you come help me? Again, we don't know the details of his work. It does seem that his career was a source of tension in the family. I, again, cannot get the... There we go. Jeez. I don't know why I can't get that. Coworkers and Annette's friends claimed that Bishop wanted her to take another post outside of the U.S., and Annette wanted to continue her education, but Bishop wanted her to stay home as a stay-at-home mom. The family was also having financial problems, and the IRS had been auditing their taxes. And Bishop's mother had helped him buy the house, and she moved in when Bishop's father had died. She was close with Annette, but she had a bit of a strained relationship with her son. There's also some speculation that Bishop's mother, and maybe even his wife, were pressuring him to advance in his career. And if that's true, maybe losing out on that promotion might have pushed him over the edge. In the 1990s, a clue about the case was discovered while looking at materials in Bishop's file at the State Department. Investigators found a certified letter from a man by the name of Albert Kenneth Bankston. And at the time of the letter, Bankston was a prisoner at a federal penitentiary, and he addressed the letter to Bishop's office to the attention of Mr. Bradford Bishop Jr., Assistant Chief, Special Trade Office. And it was actually dated 16 days after the murders, but it referenced 2 earlier letters that he'd written to Bishop the month before. And it hinted at a plot to murder Bishop's family and implicated several other people. A man who was familiar with the area in North Carolina where the bodies were buried and set on fire, a woman, and another man by the name of Sonny. Unfortunately, Bankston had died of cancer 9 years before the letter was found, so he couldn't be questioned about it. But the police were able to speak to the 2 men implicated in the letter. One told them that Bishop had paid him to kill his family, and that they were actually supposed to do it while Bishop was away in Europe on business. And then the other man said that he didn't know anything at all about it, and that he wouldn't have done it because he wouldn't have killed the children. That was against his code. Over the years, there have been reports of sightings of Bishop. Bishop was added to the FBI's most wanted list. He was featured in television shows, including Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted, which has resulted in thousands of tips. There was even a bluegrass song written about the murders called The Ballad of Bradford Bishop by the band Coup de Grace. One man experiencing homelessness in Arizona was reported to maybe be him, but investigators ruled him out. Then another man who was living as a recluse in Minnesota was investigated. He actually tried to evade police, so it seemed promising, but it turned out that he wasn't Bishop, but he was actually wanted for different criminal activities, and he was later arrested. There were also dead bodies found that were reported to maybe be Bishop, one in North Carolina, one in Hong Kong, and one somewhere in Russia. They were all investigated. None of them were Bishop. So investigators think he may have fled to Europe. There have been sightings of him in England, Belgium, Finland, Sweden, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, Greece, and Switzerland. And some of these sightings were reported by individuals that knew Bishop either personally or professionally. And an interesting postscript to this crime was actually reported a couple of years ago, almost exactly 45 years to the day from when the crimes were discovered. A Massachusetts woman named Cathy Gilchrist, who had been adopted as a child, took one of those DNA tests to answer some questions about her birth parents. And she discovered that Bradford Bishop was her birth father. Apparently had Gilchrist with her birth mother 2 years prior to marrying Annette. And I personally cannot even imagine what it would be like to find out that your father, your biological father, is not only a murderer, but one who killed his entire family. But Gilchrist has a good attitude about the whole thing. When she found out about his identity, she said, quote, "I just laughed. We have a great sense of humor in my adoptive family, and I thought, of course my father's a murderer." And that is the story of family annihilator William Bradford Bishop, as well as the end of our presentations. And before we close out, I just want to mention a couple of upcoming programs that we have. So this was the first in the Maryland Department series, The Dark Side of Maryland. For the next following 3 Tuesdays, we are going to have presentations, same time, 6:30 in this same room. Next week, next Tuesday, we'll be presenting Mediums, Magicians, and the Ouija Board, a spiritualist history of Baltimore. The following Tuesday, again, same time and in this same room, we'll present Unveiling Maryland's Monsters, Folklore and Legends from the Free State, in which I'll be talking about some of Maryland's infamous monsters like the Snallygaster and the Goat Man. Then on Tuesday, October 29th, back in this room again, we'll offer Haunted Maryland. It's supernatural, hun, where you can hear some spooky stories about Maryland ghosts. And I hope that you'll come back for some, if not all of them. And thank you for joining us tonight.